Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Well, today we're going to dive into the alluring world of vintage CD players. Something about those CD players of yesteryear, vintage machines from the 80s and 90s that are just very attractive. Could be their build quality, could be the design aesthetic, could be their sound signature. And maybe it's a little bit of nostalgia. Many audiophiles seek them out for various reasons. Some like the sound, some like the build quality, and will pair them with modern DACs. But before you run out and buy one of those classic DVD players from Denon or Sony or Marantz, there's a critical risk that you need to understand. It's the ticking time bomb in many of these units, and that is the CD transport. So what is a transport? Well, that's pretty much the heart of the CD player itself. It's that mechanical mechanism that spins the CD, moves the laser along so it can read the data on the CD itself. Now the transport has many components. It involves motors and gears and sleds, and most important, the laser assembly for pickup. And just like any mechanical system, over time these things wear out. Motors can fail, lubricants can dry up, gears can crack, but the biggest culprit is often the laser itself. Lasers have a finite lifespan. They degrade and they lose their ability to accurately read the disc over time. So you might be thinking, well, something breaks, I'll just get it fixed. But here's the problem. Unlike other analog components of the day, like receivers and amplifiers and turntables, parts for vintage CD transports are simply unavailable. It's quite a different story. During the peak of the CD era, only a handful of companies made these CD transports, and they were used in hundreds of models over different companies. Think of giants like Philips and Sony. Those transports were put in CD players from companies like Marantz, Meridian, Krell, and many, many others. So these specific transports, like in the unit you're probably looking at if you're looking at a vintage unit, they haven't been made in decades. Those production lines are long gone, and finding a new old stock transport, probably quite impossible at this point. If you do find one, they're probably going to be very expensive and in many cases worth more than the unit itself. And even then, if you do find one on the shelf, it's possible that over 30 years since its production, the laser could have even potentially degraded. So assuming you can't find a new old stock, the only next option you really have is to find a donor unit. And it's getting harder and harder to do that because those units are also becoming more rare. And if you do find one, there's no guarantee of anything. The unit may last for years, or it may last for just weeks after you bought it. So the difference here is that the transport itself is quite different from the DAC, that's the digital to analog converter, and other components that are within the CD player itself. Those components typically use solid-state electronics that just don't wear out, similar to the way we think of our vintage gear for like amps and receivers. Those sorts of components in them can be fixed. So this is why the transport is the Achilles heel of the CD player. Even if you plan to use a vintage CD transport paired with a modern DAC, you still have the possibility of a high rate of failure, because that mechanism in there is aging and the laser itself is the main weak point, and there's simply no fixing it. So how do you know if a transport is failing? Well, there are several things that can typically happen. You can get increased reading disk errors or skipping, and that's especially on disks that are fine otherwise. The player taking longer and longer to recognize the disk after you put it in. Or it's a complete failure to read the table of contents. Oftentimes too, you'll hear the mechanism become more noisy. It takes longer and longer to continue to try to read the disc, and it just makes a lot more noise than it did when it was new. So buying a vintage CD player, it's a bit of a gamble at this point. You might find one that's been lightly used and it works perfectly fine for several years. You might buy it and it works fine initially, and it might work for a couple of weeks or even a couple of months, and then you start to have issues. After that, what you have is a very expensive, cool looking piece of gear that doesn't do anything. Now, as I mentioned, unlike other vintage pieces of audio gear like amplifiers and receivers and turntables, those units are typically made from electronics that can be replaced. Most often we think about capacitors, but there are other components in there that can typically be replaced, like diodes and resistors, etc. But a failed CD transport, unfortunately, there's just no remedy for that. So what's the solution? Well, to be honest, my advice is to simply be aware of the risk. If you're considering a vintage player, just know the factors going into it and do some homework. Be aware that eventually the CD transport is going to fail. There's just simply a lifetime of hours that they can continue to play at a high level. Now, you can ask the seller about the history of it, but to be honest, it can play just fine for a very long time, and maybe that lifespan is 90% of where it's going to be, and the seller sells it. They have no real knowledge of knowing when is it going to fail. But eventually, after enough time, they eventually will. And that's a sad thing. It's very disappointing. I have quite a few CD transports myself that are incredibly built units. I have some from Pioneer. I have this Krell unit that I was showing some video of, and they're fabulous transports. They're incredibly well built, but the laser CD transports themselves have failed. And I've tried to look around and find replacement units for them to no avail. Unfortunately, I have a great cabinet and it's a wonderfully built unit, but unfortunately I can't fix it. I can't get it fixed anywhere. So as I showed recently, there were some fantastically cool units made in the 90s and even the 80s. And I love vintage gear, and I wish that some of these units would still be dependable today, but the honest truth is they're not. There are so many of them out there that are just cool. The ones from Nakamichi, the ones from Krell, the ones from Macintosh, they're all extremely well built. But unfortunately, they have a component in there that you just can't find a replacement part for it, at least not to my knowledge. If someone is aware of how to rebuild a transport mechanism, please chime into the conversation. Would love to know if anyone has figured out a way to sort of refurbish a CD transport. Obviously, you can't do it for everything, but if somebody can figure out how to do it on some of these higher end units, you would be quite busy for years to come in fixing some of these. But to my knowledge, it's not possible. So just a bit of a buyer beware. I'm a vintage audio guy. That's why I focus mostly on amps, receivers, speakers, etc. And turntables and cassette decks are great as well, because in most cases you can get them fixed. But when it comes to a CD player, it's tough going, and it's bit bittersweet that many of these units cost so much when they were new, only to fail after just several years of use, and there's no way to fix them. So that's it for this week. I thought it was a very interesting and important topic to cover. Let me know what your guys' experiences are. If you like this video, hit subscribe, give us a thumbs up while you're there. As always, see you next time.